So my first question really is, Greg, how did you come about actually founding this company? What drove you to come up with the idea to go into energy? Because you're not from that sector, right?
No, I think and some people in the room may be interested in entrepreneurship and so on, because I think good ideas often come at you multiple times from different angles. So I could go on forever, and if you've ever heard a founding story on a podcast, it may be different than this. They're all true. They're just different dimensions. But I suppose, look, my own personal experience of energy companies was poor. The service was, shocking. The pricing model was particularly annoying. I mean, I moved into a house, I opened an energy bill, it was very high. I phoned up the energy company and they halved it. And instead of being grateful, I was like, well, why did I have to phone you? And they said, oh, well, you've just moved in, we didn't have your details, you weren't in contracts. And I thought that made sense. So I relaxed. And a few years later, I finally opened another energy bill and it was like exorbitant. And so I phoned them up and again, they halved it. And I was like, oh, near enough halved. And I said, how does that work? And they said, you weren't in contract. I said, no, I was, I phoned it before. And they said, no, it's only a 1-year contract. I was like, what, I have to phone you every year or you rip me off? This is like, if that's the core of how you operate, I think we could do this better. And so that was one thing. Another thing is, in the mid-2010s, some people remember, a bit like now, energy prices were exorbitant. And a bit like now, a lot of energy bosses would blame green taxes. I didn't think it was, I thought there's got to be a world in which we can do the right thing by the climate rather than the lazy assumption that you have to choose between affordability and sustainability. And I looked at that a little bit. It just turned out energy companies you have these pricing models. That was what was causing the high prices. And they were very inefficient and terribly non-innovative. So I guess there were a bunch of reasons I thought we could probably do this better.
Yeah, and you early on decided that it's going to be about renewables, right? Why renewables, and also what makes renewables so exciting but also difficult?
Well, you know what, to begin with, we were going to be primarily about affordability. The very first business model was Ryanair of energy, right? Which was going to be absolutely fully automated, operationally brutally efficient to keep costs down. And it was only one of our investors, just before the invested, said, we love the idea, but why don't you provide the world's best service as well? And honestly, for a moment, I thought, actually, I think we can write technology that will do that. You shouldn't have to trade off. So through technology, we could create better service and greater operational efficiency. But we were going to be greener than average, but that was going to be quite secondary. And then on our first management away day, maybe 18 months into the business, we sort of spent 2 days at some country retreat, sweating over flip charts. And at the end of a hard day's brain work, I said to the team, like, tonight we're going to watch a movie. And they went in the room, there were bean bags and popcorn and stuff like that. And then the screen came on, and I think they all thought it was going to be, I don't know, like Love Actually or whatever people like. And instead, it was Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Sequel. And you heard this sigh of annoyance around the room as a dozen people kind of think, here we go again, like, when do we get a break? And about 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in, everyone's phone started buzzing, and we were all WhatsApping each other, going, we have to do more. You suddenly realize, even though we were a tiny startup company, we had the opportunity to go a lot further than just being a bit better, but actually to really focus on how do we drive energy that doesn't contribute to climate change or contributes a lot less, and make that fundamental. But it was really that one movie inspired us so much.
What was the reaction when the other companies found out that there's a new startup called Octopus Energy coming along?
One of the great things then was, to be honest, no one noticed and no one cared. Around that time, there were a rash of new companies, actually, most of which went bust during the last crisis. Something we predicted, by the way, because very few of them had a big vision. They were just kind of piling it high, selling it cheap. And as soon as the going gets tough, they get going. And you could see that was going to happen. But it's quite interesting when there were dozens of companies. And it was a complete coincidence. We had no idea, as we were getting ready, that there were going to be loads of others. But the UK regulatory framework allowed this kind of entrepreneurship. So I remember 2 or 3 years in, I was doing presentations at industry events saying how great Octopus was. And relentlessly all they do is, well, it's easy when you're small. And then you get a bit bigger. And they go, but it's easy when you've got early adopted customers. And then you get a bit bigger again. And they go, but it's easy when. And, eventually they'll go like, well, it's easy when you're just doing it in Britain. So we're doing it in 8 more. And then and the whole thing is, every stage, incumbents tend to dismiss you until one day they wake up and realize that an awful lot of their customers have gone. And then it really is a race between us to get big and them to get good. And that's kind of, I don't know, we're still in that race at the moment.
I mean, in a way, you are now the biggest company.
Well, you're streaming. There's probably
right?
some of them listening. I check my phone for WhatsApps from them because it's always quite fun.
But as Octopus becoming the new incumbent in a way, because you're now the biggest company in the UK, and you have much different structure to when you started. It was in 2015 when you set up.
Yeah. I think if you may see some of the stuff that I and Octopus say in the media and social media and so on, relentlessly campaigning to change the system. And I think the definition of incumbency is not about size. It's, are you trying to keep things the way they are, or are you trying to change them? And I don't think anybody is trying as hard as we are to change stuff. And so, definitely not an incumbent.
Yeah.
I mean, by the way, but I do worry about it. I worry about how do I make sure we never get that way, because it's always tempting to say, like, the best thing for us now would be like, we stay exactly as we try and keep everything as it is. But the reality is that would be terrible for customers, terrible for industry, terrible for the...
What trajectory when it comes to prices?
So we have a sophisticated Oxford audience. So rather than the tub thumping, let me outline a paradox at the moment. Through the technologies of renewables, of heat pumps, solar panels, batteries, and the ability to intelligently control a hot water heater, we now work with house builders to build houses that don't have energy bills. Right? I mean, we underwrite 5 years, sometimes 10 years. And as long as you maintain the equipment, they should do better than that. And yet at the same time, the vast majority of households are experiencing yet another energy, the foothills at the moment, potentially another energy crisis. And the underlying cost of energy is increasing so much that, one of our team said at a recent select committee in the Commons that even if the electricity wholesale price fell to zero, bills would be higher in 2030 than they were last year. The government have tweaked something. It means that maybe not quite right now, but it's near enough. I.e., you've got this world in which, again, another example, people who drive an electric car and use smart charging at home pay 7 times less per mile than people who drive a petrol car. So you've got this kind of, this twin track of affordability. And by the way, sometimes people will position this as being wealthy people who can afford all this kit, kind of escape from the expensive energy, and those who can't are stuck with it. I think that's outdated now. Electric vehicles, according to Auto Trader, last week, the week before, the average price of an electric car fell below the average price of a petrol car to purchase, and the running costs are so much lower. Not only is the fuel so much cheaper, particularly if you can charge at home, but there's no oil filters. You don't really burn brake pads because it's regenerative braking. I had a Tesla for 3 years, and the total servicing costs were 120 quid. So I think you've got this world in which if you use the technologies of electrification and of renewables intelligently, you genuinely can see and even begin to experience in pockets a lower cost world than today. But somehow we screwed up our system so much that adding renewables to our grid is probably currently making electricity more expensive, not cheaper. It's not because of the technology, it's because of the way we're doing it.
It's a system that we have in the UK, that's what you're saying.
Yeah,
that needs reform.
Again, I don't know if this analogy is going to work, but look, the biggest barrier to implement it, first of all, electrification, maybe controversial, but I think it's an emerging fact. Electrification is more important than renewables if you care about climate. And that's because if you generate all the electricity for a heat pump using gas, that heat pump uses less gas than a gas boiler. If you generate all the electricity for an electric car from gas, that car has lower emissions than a petrol car. So if you want to cut emissions, the first thing you do is electrify. But the interesting bit is the more you electrify, the more electricity you're going to be using, the easier it is to switch your back end out from from fossil fuels to renewables. So you think of a world in which you go from primarily fossil fuels with a bit of renewables on the side to a world of primarily renewables with a bit of gas to back up when it's not windy, which, by the way, sooner or later will get replaced by batteries, interconnectors, flexibility, stuff like that. So I think that the first thing is electrification and then renewables. We've gone about it the other way around, and it's been very expensive. But worse than that, the mindset of the traditional energy industry is, like you'll see it all the time on social media. It's a very convenient sock puppet argument from the fossil fuel lobby, which is, what do you do when it's not windy, right? And of course, I just said we should be relaxed. That if we have to burn some gas for a period of time, that's fine. Every turn of a wind turbine blade reduces the amount of gas. That's good, right? But I think when you get that mindset, you start saying, instead of worrying about the fact that sometimes it's not windy and sunny, you think about when it is windy and sunny, we have abundant, zero marginal cost, zero carbon electricity. But we're not building our system to benefit from that. So again, conscious, we're in, is this actually a library? They're fake books,
This is a library, but the books are currently in storage because this building is getting refurbished.
So Oxford. Anyway, they're literally, these are fake books.
There's some over there.
All right, because you get these in pubs in London. Anyway, right,
They've got to come back in 2 years, and you have to come back for another talk.
What, and have a look at the book?
Yeah.
No, so what I was going to say was, but I don't know whether this analogy works, but there was a Greek innkeeper in legend called Procrustes, and he had quite an unusual approach to his guests. If you were too short for the bed, he would stretch you till you fitted, and if you were too long, he'd kind of trim your legs till you fitted. And I think we run our energy system like that. And that is that we are trying to square off renewables. So we generate this renewable stuff, except if it's windy, we turn it off, we avoid the peaks, and we pay a fortune to do that and a fortune for gas to replace it, rather than saying, how can we use this electricity? There's abundant electricity. And simultaneously, when it's not windy and not sunny, we carry on using electricity as though it was. And so no one tries to shift their consumption. And I'm not asking people to not turn their lights on, but no one cares when an electric car charges. Right? As long as you've got enough battery to drive, that works. And industry's got enormous opportunity to shift. Anything with thermal properties, you can preheat buildings, pre-cool buildings, all that stuff. But we don't have it at scale. That's not happening in our system. So just like Procrustes, we're trying to square off a variable source of power. And in doing so, we lose both the ability to use it when it's cheap and to reduce the amount we use when it's not.
I wanted to come back to, you mentioned social media and some of the comments about the wind not always shining and the sun not always shining and the wind not always blowing.
Wind doesn't often shine.
And no, it doesn't. And sort of people who worked in the energy sector for many decades haven't realized that. But there are also other comments that you've been subjected to because you're quite a vocal CEO. You're out there on social media. And I wanted to sort of maybe use heat pumps as an example because that's a topic.
They'll never work.
They never work. And I had one for 7 years, and people tell me they don't work in old buildings. But my house was built in 1880, and we're always warm, and it seems to be fine. But what causes, you think, that sort of backlash against electrification? I mean, electric vehicles, perhaps to a lesser extent now, but there's been a similar very politicized discussion around these technologies, and especially in certain parts of the media. There's, if you go to search and you just put in EVs or heat pumps, all of the articles are negative. Why is that? What is driving that, you think?
So let's be really clear, Brian. I like you, I live in an old town. I think mine was built in 1760 or 1780, and it is hit with a heat pump, and doesn't have all the fancy insulation. Absolutely fine, right? In fact, better than fine. It's lovely. But I think there's a confluence of things, some of them cynical, some of them natural, human, and some of them genuine policy mistakes that should be addressed. So, and on the very, very big picture, by the way, I think that the way that certainly the UK and Europe, to a degree the US while it was doing it, have gone around the energy transition, it could not have been done worse if you wanted public support. So if you look at what we did, for example, with renewables, there'd be a brutal consultation process with the community where the outcome was foregone. Didn't matter what they wanted, you were going to do it. Then you turn up, build a whole load of huge anonymous wind turbines on a local beauty spot, and then you increase the electricity bills with new levies to pay for it. Now that is not going to win support. If on the other hand you do, like we did an experiment, well not experiment, we ran a program where we wanted people to understand renewables really make stuff cheaper. So we had a bunch of wind turbines where we said if you live within, call it a kilometre of these wind turbines, you get cheap electricity when it's windy. 20% off it's windy, 50% if it's very windy. We call it the fan club, because wind turbine's a big fan, just to be clear. Shouldn't need explaining, probably a bad name. Anyway, either way, we wanted really to show people that if your electricity is cheap at the point it's windy, if you can see the blades turning it's cheap, you can associate renewables with cheap power, not with all those extra levies. Plus, by the way, back to the conversation earlier, if they use more when it's windy and less when it's not windy, that makes the whole system cheaper for everybody. So that was good. What we had, and we saw that, hugely successful in that. What we didn't expect was 35,000 communities and individuals have written to us asking for wind turbines, right? So you literally flip it around by making it a consumer benefit rather than foisting it on people. And you know, the model for me, by the way, was when I was a kid, I grew up in a small town outside Middlesbrough, and I remember when Asda wanted to build a big out-of-town supermarket, and the community had a decision. Do we want the 35,000 cheap products Asda brings, but there'll be some extra traffic and we'll lose a field or two, or do we want to leave it untouched? And we genuinely had that choice. And we wanted the magic Asda brought. And I always thought, like, can't we do the same with clean energy? Which is, you know, we can generate solar power at grid scale in the UK at 4 or 5 pence a kilowatt hour. And yet, you're paying 26p for electricity at home. If we put a solar farm outside at the moment, you've got towns and cities all over Britain complaining about, you know, the use of agricultural land for solar panels. Putting aside whether it's all prime agriculture or not. This is crazy. If you gave them the electricity closer to the cost price, they'd be begging for more of it. And now you talked there about, so first of all, I think the entirety of the way going around the energy transition, we're not thinking anywhere near enough about the fact that consumers, customers, voters, they're the same people. And ultimately, if we do it for them and with them, we won't get the backlash when you do it to them. Now, when it comes to heating and heat pumps, you know, you have headlines like, we're going to rip out gas boilers, we're going to, you know, it's straight away we're in the same territory. Rather than saying, you know, rather than starting off, and fortunately government started getting better, so they call it the boiler upgrade scheme. So getting into the language a little bit. But there's still an awful lot of language of forcing, as opposed to enabling, doing it for, allowing it, like, with electric cars, people go, yeah, but, you know, I'm a salesman, I drive 400 miles every afternoon, I could never have an electric car. It's like, great, don't worry about it. When they're ready, you get one. Until then, it'll suit a lot of people. And it's the same with heat pumps. So if I list off stuff that I think is relevant. The first is, we allow this idea to happen that new solutions have to be universally available on day one. So you get, well, the heat pump won't work in this home. And it's like, great. I mean, 20% of homes can't have a gas boiler because the gas network literally doesn't go there. When do you hear that? By the way, electric vehicles, 2/3 of people, you always say, oh, not everyone can charge at home. No one can charge a petrol car at home, all right? But instead, we allow ourselves to get into these technocratic arguments and defend it, instead of just like owning it. But then, if you move on to, sorry, I'm so sorry, because it's about heat pumps.
I like it that you get very excited about heat pumps. I can get very excited about heat pumps.
Yeah. I think the first thing is we allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So when you get a gas boiler installed, an independent person can come and install it in a day or so. They don't have to carry out meticulous heat loss surveys to give you payback statements, 33 pages of documentation. to demonstrate that in any scenario it will be perfect. They can literally just kind of have a look at your house, work it out, give you roughly the right thing, and off they go. Whereas with a heat pump, the process that's laid down in regulation is so laborious that a lot of people get put off at point one. And the reality is, because we're trying to make them absolutely perfect for the home, as opposed to saying, look, you know what, if we put out a bit more heat than you need, it'll be mildly less efficient, but the worst heat pump is dramatically more efficient than the most efficient gas boiler. So let's just keep it order, keep that there, make it simple for people, because when it feels complicated, no one's going to do it. And then you have a process where the monopoly networks that run your local electricity grid quite often have to sign off whether or not there's enough capacity for your heat pump. They can take up to 6 weeks to do it. And yet, one of them, there's a couple of good ones. One of them is called UKPN in the southeast. Obviously, at the back end, all they're doing is looking up a database. So they just gave us access to their database. So with them, our engineers can do it, our surveyors, engineers, whatever, can do it on site, same day, 30 seconds, you've got an answer. And yet, for most of the country, you have these long waits. Now, when you want to get a new gas boiler, you literally phone up and it'll be there in a couple of days. If it's going to take 6 weeks to get a heat pump and loads of visits, people are less likely to do it. And so, by the way, I could carry on like that. If you want to get a heat pump with government grants, it's got to heat every room in the house. So if you've had a garage conversion that is used like once every 2 years when your great aunt stays, and if it was ever used in winter, which it's not, you might put an electric fan heater in there, and it's not even got a radiator in it. Before we can put a heat pump in, we have to run radiators to it, and then prove that it will heat that home, that room in any scenario. It's kind of nuts. So even though things are getting better, we've had 1.5 million customers have asked us, inquired about heat pumps. 95% of them drop out during the process. By the way, all of that, every one of those customers, we've had to, we pay for advertising, they click on Google, they go through a process speaking to our team and so on. So it costs us a fortune, and people having to drop out every step of the way. And if we simplified the process, so many more people, instead of telling their friends, I looked at one of those heat pumps, but ... they'd be saying, I called Octopus, I got a heat pump within a week, and it's amazing. So we're kind of tying our shoelaces together as policymakers by trying to be perfect rather than just simply being dramatically better than a gas boiler.
I mean, one thing you forgot to mention, Greg, is that often you also get charged if you want to disconnect from the gas grid. So it depends on where you are, but you then get a bill from the gas company saying we've got to pay $1,500 to disconnect from the gas grid, and that's a huge cost, of course. And that's yet another barrier.
Octopus currently do that for free.
You do it for free. If your gas, you have to purchase gas from Octopus and you get it for free?
Stop purchasing it for free. Amazing. But yes. So I think currently we terminate the gas supply for free. Yeah. But I think, and no, it does cost us. But I think helping people electrify is important, and we can afford it at this scale. And we want to take away barriers. What I was going to say, look, there is one big thing here, which is there's an awful lot of people who think they're going to lose if we electrify. So in the case of electrifying heating, there's a whole gas industry that suddenly worry that the pipes that are their multi-tens of billions of pounds asset will become useless. The people that worry that the career they've had in gas as a dedicated, qualified, someone who genuinely cares about their customers and about quality and about safety and everything else will no longer have a career. And I think that, in the UK, that's tens of thousands, many tens of thousands, all around 100,000 jobs, and many tens of billions of asset value. And at the moment, I think there's not a sense of how do we manage through that future. And of course, any industry in transition, any industry threatened by change tries to defend itself. So you'll remember, when people started streaming music, the only way you could do it was through piracy because the record industry made it impossible. They thought that their business model was selling bits of plastic, CDs and records, as opposed to their real business model was selling music, and there were just better and more modern ways of doing it. In their resistance of change, because they thought they wouldn't exist in the new world, they literally ended up getting countries to change laws and send music people to jail. Actually, when the change finally came, most of them are more successful businesses now than they were before. And I think what you're seeing here is a lot of the incumbents don't know what a future world will look like for them. And so they fight tooth and nail to keep it the way it is. I don't blame them for that. For a lot of them, it's not cynical. It is literally the fear, that the inability to understand what the future might look like. Yeah. And you remember, like, Rupert Murdoch, if those who were old enough, when social media started appearing, before Facebook and Instagram and stuff, there was MySpace. It was huge. Everyone was on MySpace. And he bought it. Within 2 years, it was dead. Because the incumbents often don't know how to do this till someone else has done it and shown them how to do it. So I think there is all this resistance. And you've got to remember, the energy industry is, maybe, give or take the arms industry, the most powerful industry in the world. Right now, the focus on the war in Iran is really just about energy. It's about fossil fuels. That's the power of that industry. So frankly, fighting off heat pumps for them is child's play, even though they're the right thing to do.
There's another good example of incumbents fighting innovation from France from, I think it's 1600, when coffee houses emerged. And the winemakers really hated the idea of coffee houses, so they ran full-page adverts and they lobbied government to say coffee was unsafe and was bad for your health, bad for the economy. That didn't really work out in the end, but there's lots of examples like that. The dairy industry didn't like margarine, and there's a pattern. The horse industry in New York didn't like when cars came along.
There's a great article, we ran an advert on this, we found this great article from, I think it's from the Times in 1912, comparing tractors, sorry, it was in 1918, tractors and horses. Which one is going to be the future in agriculture? It was hilarious, because it said, tractors need constant maintenance, unlike horses, which are maintenance free. They clearly didn't have vets then. But it also said tractors couldn't cope in mud, and that horses reproduce for free. But the parallels are just uncanny with the way in which they kind of try to prevent the challenges. We've got to make this change fast. And if they delay it half a decade, 2 decades, it's dramatically bad for the climate. It's also terrible for our economy, because other economies are electrifying and we're not.
Yeah. One of the questions we always ask the audience when they sign up for these events to come with a question or a couple of questions. One of the questions that was asked was around, what about people who can't afford it? How do we make sure that it's not just a project for the wealthy who can buy their heat pump, buy their EV, their solar panels? How do we make sure, or even installers of oil and gas engineers, that there is a transition that involves everybody and is not just a project for
I think we should
the elite?
Flip this around, right? We should absolutely flip this around. When the iPhone launched, for some people who genuinely might not know that, before this there was a company called Nokia. When the iPhone launched, there was an interview on, I think it was MSNBC or something, with the then CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer. And they showed him the iPhone, and he literally laughed, and he said, it has no chance. He said, $400, $500, wherever it was, for a phone that doesn't have another keyboard. No one's going to pay $500 for a phone. And of course, and he said, and you could never use it for business. And yet, within 5 years, you could buy an Android for $20. What happened was the early adopters that were happy to spend $500 on a phone without a keyboard paved the way for the innovation and technology improvements that meant that phones became so cheap, touch phones, internet devices became so cheap, they actually revolutionized lives in the poorest countries. If we'd had that debate when the iPhone was launched, but it's not there for everyone, right? You'd never have got that innovation. And so the first thing is we should capitalize on the fact that early adopters are willing to spend money and take risks, either because they want gadgets or they care about climate or whatever their own reasons. And if we capitalize on the ability of early adopters to do that, you see what happened with Tesla. The first Teslas were well over 100 grand, I think. Very short range. The originals had 2 seats. But it paved the way, really, I think, to prove that battery-powered vehicles could become the future. They got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, to the point that, I mentioned earlier, that in the UK, we just crossed the tipping point, according to Auto Trader, where battery-powered electric vehicles are cheaper than petrol. But actually, if I look at EVs on a global scale, a BYD that costs 28 grand in the UK and is cheaper than the cheapest Tesla equivalent, costs 18 or less in China. And the cheapest EVs in China saloon cars are around about £10,000, cheaper than the cheapest petrol cars, and they're getting cheaper every year. So if we open up these markets and we understand that relentless innovation will drive down cost, actually by the time that we've driven down the cost, it becomes more and more affordable for everyone, and it's a better solution. It's more reliable. You know, you've ironed it out. So I think that's the mindset we should have. And one of the things that actually has damaged heat pumps is the original subsidy schemes in the UK for heat pumps really did ensure that they were only available for very, very wealthy people who wanted a subsidy, rather, you know. And I can't tell you how many newspaper editors tried to get heat pumps in their Georgian and Victorian homes. They didn't really work very well. It's hugely disruptive. They all got underfloor heating, and they blamed the heat pump. And they don't know that today, heat pumps are already much bigger scale, much cheaper, much more reliable. And so every time you read, there is a genuine thing in newspapers. Almost every newspaper editor or person I speak to says, "Oh, but our editor got one, and it's shit." And so we're kind of battling against the fact that we gave the subsidy encouraged those wrong behaviours. But on heat pumps, you know, look, Octopus built our own heat pump factory. We built it in Northern Ireland to try and make cheaper heat pumps that are cheaper to build, cheaper to install, cheaper to run. And actually, if we drive scale, then we'll get mass solutions that work for everyone. Also, my team would go mad if I didn't mention that I talked earlier about being able to build homes where we eliminate energy bills. We do that with social housing, with housing associations, with shared ownership. So we've got a program called Tenant Power that essentially enables housing associations and local authorities to do the same. So that stuff is now available for everyone because it uses the mass technologies of solar panels and batteries.
Can you explain how that works? Because that is one of those things that you sort of done fairly recently, haven't you, on sort of zero carbon, zero bill homes?
Yeah. So the zero bill home, essentially, the way it works is you've got solar panels. So when it's sunny, in the UK, when it's sunny, the electricity on the grid is actually very, very cheap because there's a lot of solar being generated, usually. So at sunny, and by the way, there's less consumption. It's usually during the day when people are not home. So when it's sunny, we typically fill the battery with electricity, and then in the evening, use that electricity partly to power the house, and we sell some of it back to the grid. There's a bunch of algorithms balancing this all the time. Across the sunnier months of the year, we earn enough money doing that to be able to pay for the electricity we buy from the grid in the winter months when the solar is not as generative. And then we optimize the heat pump so that typically what it will be doing is, electricity in the UK is expensive between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. So it will preheat your home before 4 p.m. And then you need to use virtually no electricity between 4 and 7 because the home will hold the heat. And that means that the electricity we use in the heat pump, which is already a very efficient device, is also very cheap electricity the vast majority of the time. And across the year, that kind of balances out to the point there's no energy bill. So that's what we provide.
Yeah. We have an election actually today, right? We are all voting, and this topic of net zero has become quite politicized, hasn't it? What is, like, if you sort of had a magic wand, how would you like us to have? What would you do next on energy to make sure we have a transition that works, that doesn't get derailed? What needs to happen next? I think that's going to be my final sort of question, and then we can open it up to the audience after that.
Well, first of all, we have to be honest. At the moment, the UK's electricity is way too expensive. It's terrible for our industries, and it's also unaffordable for so many families. And this it's not a throwaway comment. There are plenty of families in Britain where the cost of energy means they can't afford to buy school uniforms, as an example. We can't dismiss that. I talked earlier about the way in which we run the system not being, it's designed around the old world where we've got a Procrustes problem rather than building for the new world. If we're willing to make big decisions, we can reverse this. So this year, the UK, over the last 12 months, we spent £1.6 billion paying wind farms to turn off on windy days and paying for the gas to replace it. The number of consequences of this kind of thing, first of all, it's expensive in its own right. That's going to be 6 billion a year by 2030. Now, that is partly because we built all our wind farms off the north coast of Scotland. I think we've all grown up to believe that's because it's very windy off the north coast of Scotland. But the reality is, it's because the seabed leases were cheaper there. So it's cheaper to build them. And there was a policy which is called Building Connect, which was if you build a wind farm, we'll connect it to the grid, and until then, we'll pay you compensation that you don't, I as a developer, that you don't have a connection. So developers of wind farms there was no incentive for them at all to care about whether or not the electricity could get to market. It means that, like, where we are today, by the way, just an example, is if we built a wind farm in the southwest of England, but near an existing grid connection, the electricity would be up to 2.5 times cheaper per unit that gets delivered to consumers than when we build offshore wind farms off Scotland, even if you take into account the higher land prices and the different wind patterns. i.e., it is grotesquely inefficient what we've done. Now we're going about a program of building grid to shift some of that electricity from Scotland to England, where the demand is. But because of the distortions in our market, a reasonable chunk of that is, for example, just going to get exported straight to France. Because the times it's windy in Scotland will have a low wholesale price. And so France will take a load of that electricity off us. There's no criticism about it. I love France. It's just we shouldn't be spending tens of billions to benefit French consumers because of our market distortions. That's one of the many issues. I guess the point really being it's brutally inefficient. Of course, I talked about the power of incumbents earlier. The opportunity is there to save maybe 5 billion, maybe 10 billion a year on our system by reforming these and other inefficiencies. But every pound of that is currently or expected to be the income to some company. Now, if you think about how hard a salesman will fight to flog you a car for 20 or 30 grand or a kitchen, you cannot imagine how hard these companies work to flog governments, billions and billions of infrastructure we don't need, of inefficient markets that pay their current revenues. And unfortunately, in the UK, and indeed, frankly, across many European countries, that incredible power means we're not seeing the system change we need. And I think that if we don't see that system change, we are in a world where instead of renewables cutting bills, which they should be doing, there's every risk. They may protect us from the odd spike in the gas price, although even that doesn't work because of the link between wholesale electricity and gas. But they're not bringing bills down the way that they should and the way that they need to for competitiveness and for social justice. If we don't tackle that, there's every risk that, at some point the party stops. And that would be a crying tragedy because the technologies of renewables are so much cheaper than the technologies of fossil fuels. But unless we're willing to reform the system to reveal that to consumers, the whole thing's at risk. By the way, meanwhile, China is currently building 75% of all the renewables being built in the world today being built in China. You'll hear all these stories about coal power stations in China, and now still building a few, but the utilization rates are vanishingly small. In China, a wind turbine can be built and erected for about 40% the cost of here. So every time they build a wind turbine, they're locking in 20 years of electricity that's like less than half our cost. And I think we really should be, this should be a crisis, but instead we're kind of in the sludge, a fairly typical sludge for us of decision making.
Thanks, Greg. That was a great way to conclude our conversation.
Can I add, sorry, just one thing?
You have one more thing? Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it is really important, actually, that voters are being offered a false choice at the moment because they're being offered a choice of expensive renewables or cheap fossil fuels. And the reality is fossil fuels are not cheap. We're seeing that again. Second crisis. We cannot fall for we just can't fall for the lies of the myths of the fossil fuel industry by believing that this time they're going to be different. More fossil fuels will never make it cheaper. And very briefly, if you just want the killer argument, because they say, but if we had more, drilling and stuff like that, it would be cheaper. But the reality is the fossil fuel industry are never going to invest in spare capacity, which means whenever there's a supply side shock of any scale, prices will go astronomical and there'll be risk of rationing. That's always going to be the case. It's why we've had, oil crises certainly since the 70s when I was a kid. But neither can we afford to carry on doing renewables the way we are. And one of my team had a great quote, because you'll see all these little initiatives on the edge. And she said, we're just going to run out of, there's literally not a box big enough for all these sticking plasters. We just need brave reform now. I don't mean reform the party, by the way, I'm not political.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. Let's give Greg a warm round of applause.